So without further ado, Professor Kost.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to give a selective discussion of future directions for solar cell research. This is what I'd like to do. So I want to start by discussing sort of a little bit of the motivation. Yeah? Oh, okay. A little bit of a motivation for why people are interested in solar energy, sort of where we stand right now, and then talk about where we go from here, focusing really on how we get more efficiency out of our solar cells than we currently have. And with regard to the discussion of efficiency, there's really two types that I'm going to address. One is electrical, that sort of is basically concerned with how you make better solar cells. And the other is optical efficiency, and that has more to do with concentrator systems and how we make concentrators better collectors of light and how we can use them to actually improve the performance of the underlying solar cell. And I'm going to talk about this sort of famous Shockley quasar limit here that has, it's now 50 years old and talks about what we can do for conventional solar cells and sort of tells us about, it gives us a benchmark that we can use in terms of creating new types of solar cell designs that actually exceed this limit. And also talk about future directions. Where I think some of the important work is that's happening. Now, it's really too broad of a subject to cover everything in detail. So I'll tell you what I've done. I've given what I think are some key areas for future research and directions at the risk of leaving out maybe some of you have some pet projects or some ideas about where things are going to go. And also what I've done is I've been involved for the past few years in a conference called the Optics for Solar Energy Conference, or SOLAR. We held it last week in Tucson, and where possible, I've selected results that were presented at this conference to show you as examples of future directions. That'll have the result of making my presentation a little bit more selective in the sense that I'm drawing just from the papers that were at this conference, but it also has the advantage that you're really getting sort of some up-to-date material because this is stuff that was presented just last week. So I wanted to mention that I'm from the College of Optical Sciences at the University of Arizona. We're unusual that we actually are a whole college that specializes in optics, a wide range of things, anything from solar energy to medical optics to astronomical optics. And right now we're the biggest of these sorts of optical programs. And I'm at the University of Arizona, and I noticed that we're playing the Washington State University Cougars this coming Saturday. I'm probably up here. Well, actually, I'm not sure if it's here. I'm assuming that because the last game was a home game.
It's at Arizona.
Is it at Arizona? Okay. So, okay. One of the reasons that people talk about for solar energy and renewable energy in general is they say, well, maybe we're going to run out of fossil fuel. So it's interesting to go through a back of the envelope sort of calculation to figure out how much fossil fuel that we have. And the way that some people approach this calculation is they keep in mind that that photosynthesis is responsible for producing the hydrocarbons, and and specifically the process of photosynthesis is converting water and CO2 into these hydrocarbons and some oxygen. And in fact, this is the process by which the vast majority of the oxygen in the atmosphere is produced. So by looking at the amount of free oxygen in the atmosphere, you have some idea of how much the volume of hydrocarbons that's been produced. And so the back of the envelope estimation is that there's about 10 to the 15 tons, 10 to 15 tons of O2 that we know about in the atmosphere. That corresponds to about 400 times 10 to the 12 tons of carbon, of which we seem to have found about 3%, at least, well, roughly. And so if you take sort of current energy rates, or at least if they took energy consumed, the calculation that I found was done in 2005, and they took the current consumption, the consumption in 2005 and increased a 1.4 annual increase in power consumption, and they said, oh, we've got about 400 more years, which is either a long time or a short time, depending on your point of view. It's not going to be in 10 years, but it's certainly not, it's not unlimited. We also hear a lot about climate change and global warming as another reason to think about renewables. Oh, didn't. There we go. And most of you have heard of the greenhouse effect. If you're not completely familiar with it, the idea of the greenhouse effect is that the sunlight comes in as visible light, strikes the Earth's surface, heats it up, and that this heat is radiated upwards, but because of greenhouse gases, things like CO2 and other gases in the atmosphere, that the heat gets trapped and gets bounced back towards the Earth, and keeping the Earth warm. And it is, remember what you're doing when you burn fossil fuels is you're sort of reversing the photosynthesis process. So with the process that produced the fossil fuels in the beginning was taking water and carbon dioxide and combining them. This is the reverse process, which is turning things back into water and CO2. And it's the CO2 up here that enhances this greenhouse effect and possible warming of the atmosphere. And although people generally agree that you cannot point to specific storms and say, aha, this storm was caused by global warming, there are a lot of atmospheric scientists that believe as the Earth warms, that from what they know of typhoons and hurricanes, that they should become more intense. And and of course, we've got a big example to talk about right now, which would be the super typhoon that struck the Philippines just a few days ago. And I guess when I was putting the talk together, just maybe this was Saturday, Huffington Post was calling it, said could be one of the strongest storms in world history. And I think now, from what I'm seeing online, people are saying, yeah, this was definitely one of the strongest storms in history. So from that standpoint, there's interest in looking for renewable fuels. And when you look out there, a lot of people say, well, there's a lot of different things we could look at. We could look at wind and could look at hydroelectric. I'm not sure if nuclear is considered renewable or not, but it's usually included in the discussion. But a lot of people have noticed or have said, you know, there's really nothing out there besides sunlight that really is virtually unlimited, and it can really foot the bill. And this is a slide that I borrowed from Nathan Lewis at Caltech, showing sort of what we would need to supply the world's current power requirements. So if you think about taking each of these boxes and filling them with 10% solar cells, that would provide all the energy that we currently need for the Earth. Make them a little bit bigger, and maybe you could supply future energy requirements too. Well, a lot has been happening in the past several years with regard to solar cells and solar energy. It became big news, say about 2000, and actually you can almost see it on this graph, about right here. The government poured a lot of money into research and countries started ramping up in terms of providing subsidies for solar energy. And there's a lot of companies, investment from the stock market, and countries in general investing. And the price of silicon solar cells came way down. And as they went down, the generation went up. And I got this data from the Solar Energy Industry Association, which tends to be very conservative about their results. That's why you don't see 2012 and 2013 here, is because they sort of check and check their data before they release it. But I can tell you, I did look at the more recent years, and I think 2012 was double this, and 2013 looks like it's on course to double again. So there's been a massive increase in the deployment of solar cells for power generation. Primarily the sort of crystalline silicon that you see in the background right here. It still constitutes only about 1% of our power generation capability, but growing rapidly and becoming a reality. Now, let's see what we could do to help things along. The figure of merit that people use when they're talking about solar energy is dollars per watt. Okay. The dollars, if you want to control that, you need to control manufacturing costs. And that's been a big part of what's happened in the past several years in terms of increasing the implementation of the use of solar energy. For a solar cell or solar system configuration, how do you get more watts out of it? Well, that primarily has to do with the efficiency of the solar cell, or if it's a solar concentrator system, the efficiency of the solar concentrator. And right now, the efficiency of the best silicon solar cell, which is the material of choice for most solar installations, is 25%. Commercially, they're typically on the order of 20%. Concentrator efficiency is about 70%, and I'll have a little bit more to say where this number comes from a little bit later in the talk, and why it's not 100%. Okay. Now, what could we do, though, if we're at 20 or 25%? We still got a long ways towards that 100%. So what could we do? Question is, what can we do to increase the denominator of that dollars per watt and by making solar cells more efficient? And people usually start by asking, well, what's the fundamental limit anyway of what solar cells can do? And what a lot of people do is they start with the Carnot limit, and they do this sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation. They say, well, we've got the sun, surface temperature of about 6,000 degrees, and we got the Earth down here, about 300 degrees Kelvin. And suppose we think of it as a thermal engine where the sun is delivering heat to the engine here, and then which expels heat to the Earth and extracts work. And if you apply the Carnot formula, you get this 1 minus 300 over 5,800, or about 95%. Question is, though, does this make sense? How do you thermally couple the solar engine to the sun? It's 93 million miles away. Well, the answer is you don't thermally couple it. We're not, it's not really a realistic situation. Okay. In fact, we're radiatively coupled. Any engine that we're going to make is going to be radiatively coupled to the sun. And so people that have looked at this a little bit more carefully have drawn up this sort of a picture for modeling a solar cell or solar engine where we have the sun. Our engine is radiatively coupled to the sun, then thermally coupled to the Earth. It expels energy radiatively, and then we extract some work over here. And because, unlike, say, a Carnot engine where we talk about cycles, generally things like solar cells work continuously. So typically you find people work in terms of rates. So rate of energy flow, rate of entropy flow, thermal flow between the engine and the Earth right here. So that's why we have these dots on top of these quantities right here. And this guy named Landsberg, who looked at this early on, went through this analysis. And under the conditions in which we treat the solar engine as a reversible one, and we assume that the solar cell is roughly the same temperature as the Earth, then we get, he came up with a formula for a thermodynamic efficiency that gives you a value of about 93%, which is actually almost the same as the Carnot limit. Okay. Now, about 50 years ago, Shockley and Queisser. Shockley is the famous Shockley of the who won a Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor. Came up with a limit to solar cell efficiency that was still meant to be fundamental, but more based on exactly how solar cells work. And so solar cells are typically made up of semiconductors that have a valence band and a conduction band. And when a photon comes in, then it, if it's absorbed, it creates a hole in the valence band and an electron in the conduction band. For an arbitrary photon, that electron may be at a state that's high up above the bottom of the conduction band, and the hole may be way below the top of the valence band. So the next thing that happens is that there is this thermalization process that occurs where the electron drops down to the bottom of the conduction band and the hole floats up to the top of the valence band. Let's see what we've got. Okay. So this, if we think about this process, then Shockley and Queisser immediately identified two particular contributions to the fundamental limits for a solar cell. One, they said, well, is that if we're using a semiconductor and we have light that's below the absorption edge, well, there the semiconductor is transparent, and any light that's below the absorption edge is going to be lost. So, for example, for silicon solar cells, all this light is just lost. The second thing is that if you're looking at the efficiency or the quantum efficiency, say the amount of energy you get for a photon, notice that it goes up as you get to the silicon band gap, and then it sort of drops off linearly right here. What's happening there is that when a photon comes in and gets absorbed, it creates the current of one electron flowing in an external circuit, regardless of what energy that photon had. So the higher energy photons are actually less efficient. You need more energy from the higher photons to create this unit of current in an external circuit. And that the lost energy is this thermalization energy that's indicated by these dashed lines right here. So for silicon, it's about 51% losses due to these two effects, and for gallium arsenide, about 55%. Okay. This third contribution that they identified is the one that's probably much less well understood. And let me see if I can get it across here. So here's, I took this out of a book by Greg Smithstad, one of the people who's very active in this Optics for Solar Energy conference. So solar cells are a p-n junction. The idea is that you create, a photon comes in and you create an electron hole pair in the region of the p-n junction. And the junction tends to separate the electron and the hole, so electrons go this way, holes go this way. And that ends up causing an electron to flow through the external circuit. And if you put a load resistor right here, you can get power out that's equal to the voltage, well, the current times the voltage across the load, where the voltage across the load is just the current times the resistance of the load. Now, what's also going on at the same time is that anytime you have a p-n junction, you make a p-n junction by taking a material that's very heavy on electrons and bringing it in contact with a material that's very heavy on holes. And when you put them together, the electrons want to diffuse this way and the holes want it to diffuse this way. What stops them from diffusing is the fact that when you put them together, you get this sort of a potential hill here that's a barrier to electron diffusion. Okay. What this diagram is showing is that as you generate current and you create a voltage across your load here, which is where you're getting your power out, at the same time, you're decreasing this barrier. You're increasing this little gap right here, which tends to flatten the bands. And so you're decreasing this barrier to electron diffusion and the barrier to hole diffusion. So what happens is now you want the electrons to go this way through the external circuit, but you start getting diffusion of electrons backwards the other direction. Okay. So that ultimately gives you a limit to how much voltage and power you can generate in an external load. And this third contribution that Shockley and Queeser identified, which is a sort of an electrical limitation here, gives an additional loss of about 0.3, in addition to the losses that I showed on the previous graph. Okay. So how are we doing? We're doing really well in terms of the solar cells that we're making right now, at least with the conventional single band solar cells. Gallium arsenide is really right up here pushing against right at the limit, and silicon's not far behind. This is actually the curve published in Shockley and Queeser's original paper, and these are experimental results, and they're right up there near the curve. So it tells us maybe we need to look elsewhere. Maybe not silicon or gallium arsenide. We really want to make a big difference in solar cell efficiency. Now, I also wanted to mention that those numbers that I put there are from the solar efficiency tables. These are tables that are published by Martin Green and his colleagues fairly regularly, once or twice a year. This is a great place to look if you want to know the state of the art in what's going on in terms of efficiencies of different solar materials or types of solar cells, and the three numbers that I took are listed there in the table. And NREL in Golden, Colorado, takes that data, and they have their own chart right here, and they periodically update this chart, this complicated chart of theirs, using the data from the solar energy tables. And what's nice about this is that it shows sort of what's been happening over time. So you can sort of see how silicon over time has been creeping up, so it's sort of bouncing up against the Shockley-Queeser limit right here. These are the two silicon and gallium arsenide cells that I showed, but notice there's some stuff going on up here, and there's this cell right up here. And what I wanted to address is, well, what's this? Where are these coming from? Okay. Well, those are what are called multi-junction cells, or tandem cells. And the idea is to stack cells together that have different band gaps. Now, what you do is, remember, when we talked about some of the losses for solar cells, there's this sort of a trade-off where you want to absorb all photons, so you'd like to have a small band gap, but at the same time, you get the best efficiency in terms of converting your energy into electrical current if you're absorbing near the band, near the absorption edge. So what people have discovered is that you can actually, if you stack the solar cells, tailoring the solar cells each for separate portions of the solar spectrum like this, that you actually get higher efficiency than was predicted by the Shockley-Queeser limit for an individual cell. So use a cell with a material with a large absorption or a large band gap for the blue light, slightly smaller band gap for the green light, and so on, down like this. And people have been doing this, and this is a schematic for the current world record holder. This is by Sharp, the corporation. They have a 3-junction cell that uses for the large bandgap material, indium gallium phosphide, then gallium arsenide, then an underlying indium gallium arsenide layer. The sun would come through like this. You can see it's a rather small cell. And they've also identified portions of the solar spectrum that are absorbed and converted by the different parts of the junction. And they've gotten 44.4% efficiency. This was with concentrated sunlight. And you can see it's above that roughly 31% limit of Shockley-Queisser limit. Now, how good is it, though, compared to what? Well, these are actually theoretical curves, or numbers. So here's that Shockley-Queisser number for a single cell. One junction, not stacked cells, anything like that. Roughly 31%, corresponding, if you use a material that's has a band gap roughly that of gallium arsenide. As you increase the number of cells doing this tailoring process that I was just talking about, then the theoretical efficiency goes up. And in the case where you have a continuous or an infinite number of cells, they predict something on the order of 70% efficiency. So this tells us how well we're doing. Well, 44% is not too far, for triple junction is not too far away, but we still got a little bit of room to move here. And it also tells us what we can do to improve the efficiency, overall efficiency of these tandem cells. One is we could continue optimizing triple junction cells to try to boost that 44 up closer to 49%. Also, we could add cells, because we can certainly, by adding cells, we can certainly get higher efficiency. Yeah?
And it's not going to 100% just because of the electron hole backflow?
Yes, that's right. That's exactly right. At infinity, the missing amount is that 0.3 that came from the electron hole backflow. That's right. Yep. Both of these, I mean, are difficult to do. People have been working pretty hard on optimizing these triple junction cells. They're already getting, it's not too bad. We don't have a whole lot of room to go, and people have been working, there's a lot, almost everything that we can do has already been done here. Adding cells is difficult because these are already very complicated structures. It's not easy to stack these materials on top of each other. They're single crystal materials. All the lattice constants have to match perfectly. So it turns out to be somewhat difficult to add cells. So,
cost?
what's that?
Cost?
Well, it becomes more expensive to do that. No,
It's very non-linear either.
what's that or that?
It's non-linear. I mean,
Oh yeah.
between, when you have these very complex,
Well, these are very expensive cells, and I can tell you that later on I sort of was leaving that discussion until concentrators, but actually these kinds of cells are always used in a concentrating configuration, and the reason for that is because they are too expensive to put them all over the earth. So instead, you try to put big mirrors and focus the light down onto a small expensive cell down there. Okay. Now, so there's been this idea around about spectrum splitting that's been around there for a long time. With spectrum splitting, it's almost like using, it's the same idea as these multi-junction cells. You take different portions of the solar spectrum and you send them to different solar cells. The difference with spectrum splitting, though, is that instead of stacking the solar cells, you just put the solar cells, each of them individually side by side, and just direct the light different places. And so this was a paper at the Tucson conference about a group that's been working on a spectrum splitter that is a polychromatic lens up here. And they've done a little bit of experimental results, but I think, but from what they presented, the most relevant data was probably their simulation showing what sort of overall efficiency they expect that they can get. And you see them as they increase the number of cells. They say number of band gaps. It's really the number of cells that are down here. They're getting up here depending on which of these two curves, the upper limit, are the realistic design here, somewhere between 45 or 55%. So people are still this idea of spectrum splitting is particularly as the as the multi-junction, the complicated multi-junction cells run out of steam, this idea of spectrum splitting, which is an older idea, is starting to gain steam again, and there's starting to be a whole lot of interest in using this approach to creating a way to split up the spectrum and get higher efficiency out of the cells. Okay. Another way that people have looked at performance, and I think, let's see. Yeah, I'm just about to go into solar concentrators. So I want to leave cells by mentioning another way that people looked at performance. And this is to look at what they call plasmonic cells, or applying plasmonics or resonant structures to solar cells to increase performance. Now, this has less to do with increasing fundamental efficiency and more to do with how to make an existing solar cell work better by increasing its absorption. And one thing is that generally people want to use less material when they make solar cells, so they make them as thin as possible. And and for that reason, they don't always absorb all the light that comes in. Also, it is true, maybe this is a more fundamental result. For a given solar cell, there's always loss of photons below the band gap where it's transparent. And by resonating light, sometimes you can improve that. You can absorb a little bit more of that infrared light for a given material by resonating the light near that material so that it has more chance to be absorbed. In the particular structure that was discussed here, and again, this was another paper presented at the Tucson conference, they were talking about both a patterned thin film amorphous silicon layer and a patterned underlying silver layer, and they did some modeling of both energy flow and field distributions in these sort of pattern structures. And what you're supposed to get out of this is that you see that the light, instead of coming here and bouncing off, it sort of circulates around these pattern structures. And that circulation gives it an extra chance to be absorbed by the material, which gives an enhancement in the absorption. And they're showing here the enhancement effect. They designed it specifically to enhance the infrared absorption, which is typically fairly weak in the amorphous silicon, and showing they can get significant enhancement, and somehow something seems to be going off to infinity right here on this one. I'm not too sure if I believe that this is realistic, but the idea is that if you can get a factor of even a 3 or 4 in the enhancement, that you're going a long ways towards reducing the amount of material or increasing the infrared response of the solar cell. Okay, so I mentioned before that there's a couple of ways we can talk about increasing efficiency. The underlying cell, or in the case of a concentrator, increasing the efficiency which we collect the light to be focused or to be imaged on another cell. Concentrators just are inherently fun things to look at, and there have been some crazy ideas out here. This was a company called Cool Earth that was doing these big balloons for a while. Their idea was, well, balloons are thin and cheap, and so they were using sort of the same sort of mylar material that you use for birthday balloons and building these big structures right here. So the idea with a solar concentrator, basic idea, is that you take some sort of a large optical element that can concentrate light, hopefully one that you can make inexpensively, and then concentrate the light on a smaller solar cell that is possibly higher efficiency. And by reducing the amount of solar cells, you can reduce the cost of the solar cells, and also you can afford to use higher efficiency cells because they can be small. This all has to do with cost right here. So get higher efficiency at lower cost. What might not be so obvious is that concentration also reduces back current loss, sort of other loss that we were talking about. I would say an intuitive way to understand that is that back current loss is a competition between the sun trying to drive current one way and the diffusion which is driving current the other way. And if you concentrate light, you have a higher flux of sunlight or induced current, and so that it makes a more favorable situation when you concentrate, because it tends to swamp the back current. that make sense? Okay. And you can see that actually. So if you look at the concentrator here, under one sun, remember we go, with an infinite number of cells, we go up to about 70%. And as we increase the concentration towards the theoretical limit, then with an infinite number of cells, we can get a higher efficiency. And that's just because we're reducing the impact of this back current loss. Okay. The absolute illumination we can get is large but finite because the sun is not a point source and we can't focus it to a point source. It is a disk with a finite angular dimension in the sky. Okay. Now, remember I said that at the very beginning I listed 70% as the sort of the current optical efficiency of concentrators. And so I was going to tell you where that comes from. Sunlight comes in two forms. We've got direct sunlight, which is sort of the light coming directly from the sun going through our concentrating element to our solar cell. And then there's this diffuse sunlight. So we've got it scattering off the sky, trees, buildings, the ground, everything like that. And that can actually be it can be a fair amount of light. It can be close to something like 25 or 30% of light. It's really, of course, very sensitive to conditions. Some places have more or less diffuse scattering than other places. But typically, we're talking about maybe 30%. So, and unfortunately, typically, concentrators lose all that because concentrators are designed to take this vertical light and focus on the solar cells. The diffuse light usually it just misses the cell altogether. Or if it does come down, since it's not concentrated, we get very little, well, we get a very small fraction of the light that we want right here. So we're actually, this is something that we just have to live with most concentrator systems. And in fact, when people are talking about concentrators, they usually just sort of forget about this and say, I've got 100% efficiency. And what they really meant is I got 100% efficiency of this direct sunlight because I'm not even going to think about this diffuse sunlight. I can't do anything with it at all. Now, that's not entirely true. So I just want to put one slide to indicate how you might be able to address diffuse sunlight. There's these things called luminescent solar concentrators. And basically the way they work is they're a flat plate that has some sort of a luminescent material in it. Quantum dots are one candidate. So if sunlight comes in and it enters the plate, it gets absorbed by the quantum dots, and then the quantum dots re-radiate in all directions. And usually these things are designed such that the light that's re-emitted by the quantum dots will bounce around traveling laterally in these plates until they get to a solar cell that's attached to the edge. So you're taking all this light here and sort of concentrating it towards the solar cell on the edge. Well, in principle, this one, since it doesn't have those optics up there, those collecting optics, it can actually collect, in principle, the luminescent solar concentrators can convert both direct and diffuse sunlight. So that makes them of interest. They have a lot of problems of their own that I'm not going to address today. So it's not a slam dunk, and it's not like we want to drop everything else in favor of luminescent concentrators at this point. If somebody wants to talk about that, about their limitations, I'd be glad to. So let me get back to sort of more of the conventional solar concentrators here. And one thing is, people can do a pretty good job of making them, if you throw out diffuse light, you can get near 100% efficiency in the sense that you can take almost all your direct light and image it onto a solar cell. That's not too much of a problem. The problem comes with misalignment. Okay? If you tilt an element with respect to the sun, it's very possible that you're going to get some rays that will be lost. Okay? And you might say, well, why would we do that? I mean, why would we tilt it? Well, it's a couple of things. One is that at high concentration, this angle is actually fairly small, so we have to be pointed pretty precisely at the sun. And not only that, remember the sun is moving during the day, so we have to track it. So we have to track the sun along, and we have to stay within a certain angle right there. So even if we can track precisely, we're often very interested in what happens under misalignment, because we want to know how sensitive our system is to misalignment, and maybe how accurate our tracker has to be. And if we can build a concentrator that is less sensitive to misalignment, that can collect a lot of light even when it's misaligned to somewhat to the sun, then we're better off, because we can use less expensive tracking equipment, for example. Okay. There's a man named Roland Winston at the University of Chicago, now at UC Merced, who sort of pioneered solar concentrator optics, what they really call non-imaging optics, and talked about sort of the limits to concentration and the relationship between this misalignment or acceptance angle. How much misalignment can we tolerate versus how much we can concentrate, and found that there was a trade-off, this right here, saying that the angle at which all sunlight that enters a concentrator, the angle of the range of angles that we can accept depends on the concentration using this formula right here. So as the concentration gets higher, the range of angles that we can accept is smaller, and vice versa. So generally, that's something we do have to, this is a physical limit that we have to deal with. If you have high concentration, you're going to have a system that's fundamentally more sensitive to misalignment. Winston also came up with the ideal shape for a concentrator. It's called a compound parabolic concentrator. It's not immediately obvious at first why it's different than just a parabolic mirror, for example. The way that's different actually is that if you think of this, you see this parabola right here? Normally, when you think of like a parabolic telescope, you've got a single parabola with a focus in the middle right here. Here's a parabola. The focus for that parabola is over here. Here's a parabola right here, and the focus for that parabola is over here. So we've got multiple parabolas right here, parabolic shapes. And the way you can make a three-dimensional shape here is by revolving these parabolas around. And for this particular shape, this is an equality right here. So theta is equal to the arc sine of 1 over the square root of the concentration ratio. Okay. And one of the papers presented by a group in Tucson was talking about their experiments with a low concentration compound parabolic parabola that was not really the ideal shape because, see, it's easy in a textbook to talk about a compound parabolic parabola that's got a disc-like or circular aperture right here, but in practice solar cells are square, so they had built this sort of a square shape compound parabolic parabola right here. Okay. Now the other thing that I wanted to say is that if you look at these non-imaging textbooks, what they frequently are concerned about is they'll talk about acceptance angles, and what they define to be the acceptance angle is they'll say, okay, we're going to take our compound parabolic parabola, our compound parabolic concentrator, and we're going to tilt it. And we find that we get all of the light concentrated from the top to the bottom until we get to some acceptance angle, and then it starts to decrease. And they say, okay, here's our acceptance angle, and then they stop worrying about the shape of this curve at all. Okay, they just say, here's our acceptance angle, and that's all we're concerned about. Well, in the real world, the shape of this curve is very important. You want to know, does it fall off abruptly? Does it fall off like this? I mean, what's the shape? The details about exactly what happens when you don't collect 100% of the light, when you're beyond the acceptance angle, is important. So beyond just the acceptance angle for a solar concentrator, it would be nice to know the optical efficiency as a whole, plotted out as a curve as a whole function of the misalignment angle here. Okay, so now a second thing I wanted to mention is that, and this is where the cell efficiency and this optical efficiency of the solar concentrators sort of merge and become, get intertwined with each other. Turns out that even if a solar concentrator can collect all the lights, it's important how it distributes the light on the cell. If it's not uniform, you may have cell degradation. Remember that in general, that as we already saw that as we concentrate light, that we reduce the effect of that backflow current, which has a tendency to increase the optical and to electrical conversion efficiency of a cell. So we might think if we got a hot spot, in other words, if we are accidentally focusing light to a single point on a cell and it gets very hot, that we might actually get an increase in efficiency because of the decrease in the backflow current effect. But ultimately, what usually happens before that is that the cell gets so hot that we get thermal degradation of the cell, and we start to see the efficiency of the cell go down. So the distribution of how well a solar concentrator distributes light on an underlying solar cell is really important in terms of the performance of the system. So this is actually, the next few slides are ones that I actually presented at the same solar conference in Tucson. This is another company I was working for that was looking for a medium concentrator, and they were using a Fresnel type lens to concentrate. And they were looking at Fresnel versus a prismatic lens. That's in the next slide here. I'll tell you what a prismatic lens is. And comparing things, they had already convinced themselves that this second type of lens that's in the next slide was going to be lower cost manufacturing. But they're interested in its optical performance. They wanted to know, what about misalignment? Which of these different sort of concentrating elements that we can have for a concentrator, which is less sensitive to misalignment? So first off, let me tell you, a Fresnel type concentrator lens is, I assume that most of you have heard of a Fresnel lens. It's just a sort of a flat lens-like element. The idea is you usually focus to a point that's below the PV cell, and what that does is it takes all the light that's incident on the concentrator and splits it out over the cell here. What this prismatic concentrator does, it's a true non-imaging device. There's no focal point here. In the prismatic concentrator, you've got a series of regions, and the way it works is that you see that there are some, region number 1 is a Fresnel prism that takes all the light that's incident on area 1 and then just images it onto the underlying cell. So each of these 9 regions here is imaged onto the cell, so we get a 9-to-1 solar concentrator right here. And you can't talk about an object, an image, or a focal point. That just doesn't exist here. We're simply redirecting light in order to improve the concentration. Both of these can work. The company was interested in this because for each of these different regions, when you make these grooves in the prism concentrator, they're all the same angle, so you don't have to adjust the angle when you're tooling your different mirror right here. And so they had done the cost and said this was going to be cheaper, but what about its performance? So I looked at this particular concentrator, or this particular geometry for them. This was a one-dimensional concentrator, 15 times, 15x. They intended to use some guiding reflective panels on the side. The reflective panels was to help with misalignment so that, well, it's actually a dual purpose. It helped with misalignment because that way, even if there was some misalignment and some light was directed off the side, then there's still a chance that it can bounce off the reflective panels and make it to the solar cell. It also was a support structure, so it actually held in place these mirrors up here. And I looked at a Fresnel lens and the prismatic type concentrating element, both sort of the way that I showed you, which I would call the conventional geometry, and an overfilled geometry. In the overfilled geometry, what you're doing is, instead of just imaging directly onto the solar cell, on purpose you actually make the light strike the side and then bounce into the solar cell. And it's not obvious why you'd want to do that. It does have to do with, and it has to do with uniformity, and it'll become obvious when you see the data here. But there's a chance that if you overfill your solar cell, that it may be less, that you may get a more uniform distribution when you tilt the concentrator due to misalignment. I think I'll skip this. This is just some of the details of how the calculation was done to take into account the impact of the non-uniformity of the light on the solar cell and its impact on the cell efficiency. So let's just go straight to the results here. Then here's what the profiles look like. Okay, so what we're looking here is this is the cell at the bottom of the concentrator. And the system was designed to be 15x, okay, 15 times. And so ideally, that's what we would like. We would like a uniform distribution where the concentration was 15x along the whole cell. And usually you would have also bought a cell that was optimized for 15x concentration. And what we find is that as we, well, for example, if you have 0 degrees, then we're sort of, we're roughly 15. It's varying a little bit. But as we tilt the concentrator, we start getting these hot spots. In other words, the light gets, it may actually make it down to the cell, but it starts to bunch up in certain regions of the cell. Okay? And it's most pronounced here for the conventional Fresnel concentrator that almost everybody uses. The overfill Fresnel concentrator was somewhat better, but it still had some severe hot spots also. The prismatic concentrator actually looked much better, and we were pretty excited about this. You see, as you tilt it, both for the sort of the precise case where you're imaging directly on the cell and the overfill case, they're both pretty uniform. So we sort of avoid these hot spots. Now let me see if I can sort of quantify that then. So here's what's going on. If you look at the efficiency of the, okay, this is sort of the overall efficiency of the concentrator. So let me see if I can, I want to make sure that this is clear. So 100% means that we get all the light that strikes the concentrator is imaged onto the solar cell, and it's also uniform, so there's no degradation of the solar cell. The efficiency can drop below 100% if some of the sunlight does not make it to the solar cell, or if there's a hot spot in the solar cell that causes some sort of the temperature to rise of the solar cell and cause the cell temperature to drop underneath. Okay? And you see that the Fresnel concentrator is the most sensitive to misalignment. And this can be, and this is also pretty interesting here. Most people had not taken into account the performance of the solar cell. So one of the reasons that they liked Fresnel concentrators is that they look pretty good in terms of their optical efficiency in the sense that if you don't take into account hotspots, they look like they have a fairly wide acceptance angle. They don't drop off until beyond 2 degrees. That's better than anything else on this curve here. But as soon as you take into account the fact that hotspots might decrease your efficiency, then the Fresnel doesn't look quite so good. The reason there's a range of curves here is because different cells have different amounts of sensitivity to hotspots. So this alpha here is a parameter that indicates if 0 is a cell that has absolutely no sensitivity to hotspots, 3.2 is one that's fairly sensitive. Typical cells are somewhere in this range, but maybe about 1.6 might be a typical value for the sensitivity of a cell to a hotspot. Another thing that I found really intriguing, that really stunned me, is the fact that it dips off and comes back up. And at first I thought, this can't be right. How can the concentrator be worse at 2 degrees misalignment than it has at 2.5? You know, shouldn't it get worse and worse as you misalign? And here's what actually happens. So I'm going to go back to this, if I can get there. That curve at 2 degrees, let's see, well, here's 1.8 right here, this blue line. Okay. Well, at 1.8 degrees, we have this really big hot spot right over here that's sort of, that's right here in the sort of the middle of the cell. As we tilt the cell further, we start to get some loss. In other words, some of the cell has, some of the light does, even more of the light does not get to the bottom of the cell, but that hot spot starts to get pushed over to the side. So the cell doesn't really have quite as big of an impact to this huge hotspot sitting in the middle of the cell. And for that reason, the impact on the underlying solar cell is actually smaller. Okay. So the conclusion that we found from this is that prismatic concentrators are actually less sensitive to misalignment than the conventional Fresnel concentrators. However, unlike the Fresnel concentrator, overfilling, which is often a way to decrease this sort of non-uniformity, does not actually seem to be an improvement for these prismatic cells. Okay, and then finally, I want to leave you with some overall conclusions for the talk. One is that large-scale solar power generation is now real and growing. 10 years ago, it was a little bit more of like, well, we're looking forward to the day when we have, when solar power is really making its mark. The best solar cells now are equal to or exceed the Shockley-Queisser limit that was published 50 years ago. And that finally, that there is still a lot of room for improvement. And research on both photovoltaic materials, solar cell design, and also solar concentrators continues because of this room for improvement and because they continue to make enhancements in the performance of solar energy systems. Okay, I think I'll stop right there, and I appreciate your attention.
I'll save Dr. Kuzik a trip of coming down. Or
No.
still there now. Are there any questions?
Oh, he said he had to leave at 5. Yeah.
How does the efficiency of the photovoltaic devices compare to the, I don't know how to call them, but the thermal devices that have like a water pipe running down the middle?
Yep.
Concentrator right on the water pipe?
They're higher, but no, they are higher. Of course, they don't, the truth is that the electric power people really don't care. I mean, well, they don't, actually, the electric power people don't care about efficiency at all. I mean, even though it's in there. They want it $1 per watt. So if they can build a solar thermal there's lower cost, then that's an advantage for it. But here's the thing. They are lower efficiency than photovoltaic devices. What that means is that they do require more area. And although that's not a huge problem right now, especially in Arizona, we got huge regions where we can put these things. You saw, you remember this, let's see if I can. I'm not sure what the best way to get the front of the talk. I'll just skip this. Sorry. Oh yeah, that's okay. Well, this is how much land we need to supply all the energy we need. Well, if you're looking at the whole world, it's not very big, but that's like the state of Arizona over there. And so people start getting worried about the amount of land they're using when you start putting these things down. So ultimately, I think there is an issue. You do want to be as efficient as possible, just so you don't have to cope because of the land space. Yeah.
How much does environmental fouling usually reduce that efficiency in real world systems?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the exact numbers on that. It's actually not too bad, but let's see. The thing is, they do periodically clean these things off. I'm thinking, though, I mean, if it's a 20% efficient cell, it's still only going to come down 1% or 2, just in normal use. I mean, these things are not usually caked with mud. I think I have seen them; they get some sort of a dirty haze, but they still work pretty well. I mean, you can see something that's obviously dirty, and it's still, and a 20% cell may still be operating at 18%, and then periodically they come through and wash them off. That is a concern, though. I think concentrators, tend to be a little bit more sensitive to that. somehow the light, it goes, when you've got a flat plate silicon cell, the light seems to go through whatever that sort of grime is fairly, and you still get the vast majority of the light. But it seems like the mirrors and concentrating elements are a little bit more sensitive to grime. And for that reason, I think they usually plan on, they come through and they spray them off periodically.
You mentioned stacking different cells to
Yep.
absorb a large part of the spectrum. You mentioned you have the natural glass parameters, and it's really difficult. When you split the spectrum, like you said earlier, do you still have to worry about that, or do you get out of it?
You get out of it because the cells are not, you're using separate cells. You can just you can literally take a silicon cell and a gallium arsenide cell you bought from two different people, put them right next to each other. You just split the sunlight. There are some issues about how you combine the current voltage from the two. You have to worry a little bit about that. If you've got two sources and you want to combine their power, you have to decide how you're going to combine them. You combine the voltage, you combine the current. What is it that you're combining? So it's not completely trivial, but trying to grow these things up to actually single crystal on top of each other like that's a big deal.
So, kind of, you said that the dollar per watt is the big deal for the power companies and stuff. How are we comparing to coal? How is the solar comparing to, say, coal right now? Are we still
Actually, we're doing pretty
coal
well.
significantly, or
No, I
are we
think we're,
starting to bridge that?
no, I think we're doing pretty good. That's a good question. I guess I'll tell you why it's a good question for me, because actually it had been a few years since I did a careful look at the dollar per watt. And the last time I looked, a couple of years ago, we were still about on par with coal or oil. And given that it's equal, people are going to go with coal and oil because you can produce electricity, night and day as opposed to just daytime. And it's dropped a lot. So now I think it's actually cheaper given the cost of cells. There is still, but that does bring up the issue, if it's so much cheaper, why isn't it replacing it immediately? And that's something I did not address, and which is an important problem, which is this, what they call intermittency problem. When the sun goes down, you don't have sunlight, so what do? And I've talked to I talked to Tucson Electric Power, and they said, look, we have to supply electricity night and day, so we can have solar power, but we're still going to have to build a coal plant anyway, because when the sun goes down, we need to supply the power. So if we're going to have to build a coal plant anyway, why don't we run it all the time, instead of turn it off during the day and use the solar, the electric. Of course, the answer partly is that, well, the requirement, the demands are higher during the day, so solar can come in and supply energy when there's higher demands. But storage is another important issue. So I think people are starting to realize that now we're really dropping the price of solar power, and the more we can drop it, the more attractive it is. So if we can keep reducing the dollar per watt, people are going to say, we've got to figure out a way to implement this because it's almost free. But then the issue is going to be, so what do we do about this intermittency issue? How can we store the energy so we can use it during the night? Do we come up with some new battery concept? Or people talk about pumping water with it, or compressed air in the underground caverns and things like that. That's an interesting concept.
Do you happen to know what the current status of the Desert Tech project is?
The Desert Tech?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is. I guess what.
It's the one where in Africa they wanted to build big solar energy generation plants to fuel on fuel.
Oh, no, I don't know that. I don't know what the status is. Okay. Europe, before the United States, they sort of jumped ahead of the United States in terms of use of solar energy, particularly Germany, I guess. And they were very big manufacturers. That was another surprise to me as I looked at the numbers recently, and the U.S. is actually, they're actually ahead. The U.S. is actually putting in more than anybody else in the world. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it. So the U.S. is really sort of caught up. I don't know that.
I'm sure we all have a lot of questions, but let's take this speaker one more time.
Okay, thanks.